and to experience the power of his resurrection, to share in his sufferings and become like him in his death, in the hope that I myself will be raised from death to life. All I want to know is Christ, and to experience the power of his resurrection, to share in his sufferings and become like him in his death, in the hope that I myself will be raised from death to life. Amen. Amen. Christ is risen. There are many things I would forever cherish about this weekend.
Oh, there's a lot.
I will cherish the fact that my family and I participated in worship with you in this service. I will cherish the fact of being honored by yourselves as one of the guest preachers for this weekend. I will cherish the fact that I listened to powerful sermons and messages preached during this weekend. I will cherish the warmth of fellowship and the transformational power of the presence of the Holy Spirit during the services I attended. I will cherish meeting people and sharing a laughter or two with some of the people I only see on my television screen. I also cherish the fact that I have been reunited with some friends I only have up to this point interacted with in the social media space. However, there are things I do not want to remember about this weekend. I don't want to remember the pressure I felt when Reverend Ngombo invited me to participate in the activities of this weekend. I don't want to remember the anxiety associated with preparing sermons for a weekend such as this. I don't want to remember the trepidation associated with preaching in a church congregation that is unfamiliar to me. Standing in front of God's people and seeing their faces light up with expectation was pressure enough for me that I do not want to experience again. Someone might protest this declaration. What do you think? How could you say something like that? How can someone who has been called, set apart, and given authority of leadership in the church and nation say that there are things he does not enjoy about the work to which he has been called? Every follower of Jesus, at least those we read about, has had moments that they wanted to cherish and engrave into their memories forever. They also have had moments that they have wanted to erase out of their memories. And I want to suggest to you this morning that Paul is one of those disciples. It was a moment to cherish for Paul when he had that encounter with Jesus on the way to Damascus. But also he wanted to forget the fact that once upon a time in his life he persecuted the church. And everywhere he went, he had reminders about his activities of persecuting the church. It was a moment to cherish for Paul, when by the power of the Holy Spirit, he established churches all over the shore. And when those churches started drifting away from the truth, Paul was hurt. It was a moment to cherish, when many came to faith in Jesus Christ through his preaching, but a painful moment when he was persecuted as a result of winning people to Christ. When people began following Jesus, Paul's heart was filled with joy. But when people began doing what is not according to the will of God in the church, Paul was hurt. When he saw that many who claimed to follow Christ lived in a manner that denied their faith in Jesus, Paul was disappointed. However, let me hasten to note that it was in those times of disappointment and hurt that Paul came up with the deepest, richest, and life-changing teachings. Jews and Judaizers were teaching that a right relationship with God comes only through observing the law. In response, Paul taught that a right relationship with God depends on faith in Jesus Christ. A right relationship with God is not an achievement, but God's free gift of grace to which one should respond. A right relationship with God is not won by works, but accepted by those to whom it is offered in trust. And so we could sum up Paul's teaching in this manner. No one would ever get into a right relationship with God by his or her own efforts in keeping the law. Someone can only get into a right relationship with God by having faith in Jesus Christ and taking Christ at his word, and by accepting the grace that God offers in Jesus Christ. To this end, Paul declares his ultimate wish, which is the message of our sermon for this morning. All I want to know is Christ, and to experience the power of his resurrection. Don't want to know the law, because the law does not save. I want to know Christ and experience the power of his resurrection. What does Paul mean when he speaks about knowing Christ? What does Paul mean? The verb he uses to know Christ indicates personal knowledge. The verb he uses to know Christ indicates intimate knowledge. The verb he uses to know Christ is not a cold, detached way of knowing. It is a way where his heart is fully open to God and God's heart is fully open to him. This kind of knowledge is not intellectual, knowing certain facts about Christ. It goes beyond intellectualism to a point where the knowledge about Christ he has shapes the way in which he lives his life. Let me make an illustration. Hands up. In the church, those who know Nelson Mandela. Hands up. Do you know Nelson Mandela? Yes. Who was Nelson Mandela? The first democratic president of the Republic of South Africa. The guy who stayed in the Robben Island for 27 years. Do you know Mandela? Thank you. I like it. They all know Mandela. Is your knowledge of Mandela a first-hand experience out of interaction with him, or is your knowledge about Mandela what you read and hear about him? You see, there is a difference between knowing somebody and knowing about somebody. And so don't confuse knowing about Mandela as knowing Mandela. And so Paul is saying, I want to know Christ. I don't want to know about Christ. Sir, I want to stand here and say, I wonder how many people in this room know Christ. And not just about Christ. Because even the devil knows about Christ. Even the demons know about Christ, and they tremble at the mention of his name. The difference between them and Paul's wish is that they do not want to submit to the authority of Christ. And so Paul says, I want to know him, and I want to submit to his authority so that I experience the power of his resurrection. So discipleship involves knowing Christ. Until somebody meets Jesus, until somebody doesn't just read about Jesus, until somebody meets with Jesus face to face, and there's a conversation that takes between them and Jesus, and there are certain covenants that are made between them and Jesus, and there's a change in life and character and behavior that arises out of that encounter with Jesus. Only then can somebody claim to know Christ. Only then can somebody claim to know Christ. And we are going to just talk about the power. Wait, just allow me to talk about the power. I want to know him. I want to live in an intimate relationship with him. I want my ways to be ordered according to his will. I want every day to wake up and be bound to his authority. I do not want to take a step further on my life without him saying something to my life. I don't want to carry life with disappointment without knowing what he has to say. I don't want to make a decision without Christ ordering my choices. If I want to know him, I want to know him. I want to know him. But what about the power of his resurrection? What about the power of his resurrection? You see, for Paul, resurrection is not just an event that should be left to the pages of history, because it is something that happened in the past. Resurrection is not simply something that happened there, that has no impact and relevance for my life. That's all. However important resurrection was, resurrection is a dynamic power. I didn't have words to express this. Resurrection for Paul is a dynamic power that operates not only in the life of an individual, but in the life of a community such as this, in the life of society, in the life of the world at large. Resurrection is the dynamic power of God that dissolves the mist of doubt and fear in a world that thinks that God is dead. I wish I had time to repeat some of these statements because they sound powerful to my own ears. I don't know to yours. But resurrection is the dynamic power of God that dissolves the mist of fear and doubt in a world that would rather live with a dead God. And I dare say, in a church that would rather live with a dead God. Resurrection. Resurrection is the dynamic power of God that raises new hope in a world that is in despair. Resurrection is the dynamic power of God that dispels darkness that engulfs the world today. Resurrection is the dynamic power of God that melts ice blocks of sadness and turns them into rivers of joy. Resurrection. Knowing the power of the resurrection means living with the blessed hope that even though the clouds are gathering, even though the storms are raging, even though the winds are blowing, I am at peace because I know who controls the outcome. Knowing the power of the resurrection means living with the blessed hope that even though the clouds are gathering, even though the storms are raging, even though the winds are blowing, I can be at peace because I know the one who holds the outcome. The power of the resurrection, I don't need to tell this to you, you know it, is demonstrated on the third day of Jesus' death, according to John. Depends which gospel encounter you are reading. If you read Mark and Luke, they will tell you that there were other women with Mary who went to the tomb. So just allow me to be true to John and just mention one woman. He mentions Mary. You understand that, right? So if I don't say anything about the others, it doesn't mean that I don't know that it happened. But I am focusing on the account. I know there were Salomes and others, according to Matthew and according to others, but John just mentions who? Mary. Okay? So I know. You know, preachers, when you interpreting the word, please remain true to the author. So don't just go, just remain true. Because in your reflection of scripture, you are also interpreting the mind of the author. Okay? So as this will show just because ukufana le yayithethwa ngomnye ahambe ilanda, I will go through to the text and to the mind of the author. are interpreting today is the mind of John, who says just Mary and mentions no other woman. So when I just mention Mary, I am interpreting the mind of John. Next year I'll interpret the mind of the other, but this year, according to John, Mary was alone when she went to the tomb. And the place to which Mary was going is the place of death. There's no one who lives in the tombs. To her surprise, when she got to the tomb, Mary discovered that the place of death had suddenly been transformed to a place of life. She left her home in the morning, walking in that miserable state of sadness and grief, because she was going to a place of death. But when she got to the place, she found that it had been miraculously transformed into a place of life. The one she thought was dead and buried in the tomb, the one whose body she had expected to find in the tomb, was alive. Resurrection power turned a place of death into a place of life. It turned a place of darkness into a place of light. It turned a moment of grief into a moment of joy. It turned a situation of despair into a situation of hope. That's the power that Paul wants to know. Don't tell me about how bad things are. Don't tell me about how tough the challenges are. Don't tell me about how nobody has ever climbed that mountain before. Tell me about the power of the resurrection. Don't tell me about how bad things are in that house, in that neighborhood, in that city, in that country. Just tell me about the power of the resurrection. You see, the power of the resurrection is not just the raising up of a dead body. It's God recreating the universe. It is not by accident that the fall of humanity happened in a garden, and the rising of Jesus Christ happens in a garden. Can I interpret this? It is not by accident that the fall of humanity, as the Bible tells us, happened in a garden. Garden of Eden. It's not an accident that the resurrection of Jesus happens in a garden. God is reclaiming back what was taken in that first garden and recreating what was destroyed in that garden. That is why the resurrection takes place. So, resurrection is not just about raising a dead body. It is about God recreating the universe. And I wish I could hear God's voice after Jesus had climbed out of the tomb. God saying it is good. Because it was good then. For the resurrection is the recreation of the established order and the universe. In the universe. So just tell me about the power of the resurrection. If you do not know the power of the resurrection, you have not begun to live. I tell you, if you don't know the power of the resurrection, you have not begun to live. It is only people that know the power of the resurrection who, after they have fallen, are able to get up and dust themselves and walk again. Those who don't know the power will just remain in the place where they fell and will lament the state they find themselves in because they don't know the power. The power of the resurrection is the power that says to you, get up, dust yourself, and go again, for there is yet another avenue you have to still explore. That's the power Paul wants to know. And so listen to John. I'm going to use John now as a way of demonstrating the power of the resurrection. John mentions 4 things so that we can come to this point. John mentions 4 things about the power of the resurrection. Paul says, that's all I want to know. You know what? That's all I want to know. I don't want to know who are you going to elect in the next elections of the church. I'm not interested. I'm not interested in who is going to lead this august movement called Methodism. All I want to know is Christ. Is Christ and the power of his resurrection. I have no time of keeping a record of all the wrongs of others and writing them in my book so that I can elevate myself out of their own experiences. All I want to know is Christ and the power of his resurrection. I don't want to know how powerful so-and-so preaches over so-and-so in order I can measure myself against their performance. All I want to know is Christ and the power of his resurrection. I don't want to how much somebody tithes so that I can try and meet up their expectation. All I want to know is Christ and the power. I don't just want to know Christ, but I also want to know the power. I don't just want to know Christ, I want to know the power. And then John tells us 4 things about the power of the resurrection. Listen, the first thing, if you want to write, the power of the resurrection removes stones. Hallelujah. The power of the resurrection removes stones. When Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus buried Jesus on Friday, they placed a stone at the entrance of his tomb. And then, as if that wasn't enough, Pilate ordered a 24-hour guard over the tomb. As if that was not enough, that stone that was placed at the entrance of the tomb was sealed. So there's a stone, there's a seal around the stone. I'm not sure what kind of seal, but there's a seal around the stone. And then there's a man standing watch over the stone. But the power of the resurrection removes You see, this was all done to ensure that Jesus remains in the tomb. That Jesus has no escape route. What did you say last night? The waymaker. It may not be the gate, it might be just the door. If it is not the door, it's just the window. But there's a way out of the tomb. There's a way out of the tomb. A tomb that is closed with a stone. A stone that is sealed. And a guard that is standing watch over the stone. There's a way out of the stone. The power of the resurrection removes stones. Little did Pilate know that even as he was trying all these efforts in keeping Christ in the tomb, little did you know that the substance from which Jesus was made is not a decaying substance. Little did you know that the substance from which Jesus was made is not a decaying substance. It's not a substance to be closed in tombs. Little did you know. And so the power of the resurrection, they removed the stone. Early on Sunday morning, so Mary is on her way to the grave. And she's worried about who is going to remove the stone. Little does she know that the stone is already removed. And so John tells us that when she gets there, the stone is removed. That is the power of the resurrection. The kind of power that Paul wants to know. He wants to know the power that removes stones from tombs, that keep South African daughters and South African sons prison for life. He wants to know the power of the resurrection that keeps your future held up in a tomb for life. He wants to know the power of the resurrection that keeps